The sky above Hope Creek burned orange, like the world itself had caught fire. Smoke rolled across the dry fields, swallowing the road in front of Jenny Hale's white Tesla. She coughed, her manicured hands gripping the steering wheel as the flames began to glow in her side mirror. Come on," she whispered, pressing the accelerator, but the engine choked. The air was too thick, the car too modern for the chaos of nature. She tried to open the door, but the heat hit her like a furnace. For a moment she froze. It wasn't fear of dying, it was the disbelief that something so wild could still touch her. A woman who controlled millions of gallons of water with a single corporate signature. Then a voice broke through the crackle of fire. "Crouch down!" The shout came from somewhere in the smoke. Before she could react, a figure burst through the haze, a man on horseback, dark skin glistening with sweat, his shirt tied around his mouth. The horse reared, hooves striking sparks against the asphalt. He swung down, pulled open her car door, and covered her with his jacket. "Hold on, ma'am," he said. His voice was deep, calm, and commanding, the kind that made you believe him even when the world was falling apart. She felt herself lifted, her body pressed against his chest as he hauled her onto the horse. The animal whinnied, terrified but obedient. They plunged into the smoke, the world nothing but orange and gray and heat. She buried her face against his shoulder, hearing only the steady rhythm of hooves and the man's breath as he murmured, "We're almost through." They broke from the smoke into the open prairie, the air suddenly sharp and cold. Jenny gasped for breath, her lungs burning. The man stopped near an old barn, sliding off the horse and helping her down. He poured water from a metal canteen into her shaking hands. "You're safe," he said simply. His face, streaked with soot, came into focus. The eyes were tired but steady, framed by years of hard sunlight. "Name's Victor Brooks. You're lucky I was out checking fences." She nodded, unable to find words. When she tried to speak, her voice cracked. "Thank you. I didn't." He raised a hand. "Don't thank me yet. That fire's heading for town." He turned to his horse, tightened the reins. "You should stay put till the wind changes." Later, after the fire crews arrived, she sat on the back porch of his weathered farmhouse, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Victor poured her a mug of black coffee from an old enamel pot. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, standing in the doorway. She nodded, still dazed. The house was modest, 2 rooms, a kitchen filled with iron pans and the tick of an antique clock on the wall. The rhythm was steady, grounding. It sounded like the heartbeat of a place that refused to die. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Just me, the horse, and what's left of my daddy's land." She looked around. The pictures on the wall were black and white men and women in overalls, eyes proud but tired. "You fight fires often?" "Used to. Volunteered when I was younger. Now I just try to keep the land from burning up again." He looked at her more closely. "You don't look like someone who belongs out here." Jenny smiled faintly. "I'm not. I run a water company, Hale Resources. We build pipelines, reservoirs, all that." He arched an eyebrow. "A water company? Yeah. Funny." His voice was flat, but there was an edge beneath it. "Water company nearly drained this valley 10 years ago. Same logo on those new trucks that just passed by." Jenny's stomach tightened. She hadn't come here for a confession, only a business inspection. Yet somehow she felt accused. "That wasn't me. I wasn't CEO then. Doesn't matter who signs the papers," he said quietly. "It's still someone who never sets foot on the ground they're drying up." She set down her mug. "You're angry." "No," he said. "I'm tired. There's a difference." He stepped outside, gazing at the red sky over the hills. "Town's been fighting over water rights since before my daddy was born. Seems some fires never die." She watched him in silence, the weight of his words sinking deep. Somewhere behind him, the old clock ticked louder, as if keeping time for both of them. That night, Jenny slept on the couch, her dreams filled with smoke and the sound of hooves. She woke before dawn to the smell of cornbread and coffee. Victor was already up, standing by the porch, looking toward the valley where the fire had burned itself out. "They say it started near the river," he said as she stepped outside. "Lightning, maybe, or some kids fooling around. Hard to tell what causes the end of things." She wrapped the blanket tighter. "You saved me, Victor. I don't even know how to thank you." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Don't thank me. Just do something good with the time you've got left. His words stayed with her long after she drove away that morning. She didn't know it yet, but that fire was only the beginning. It would burn through her career, her beliefs, and everything she thought she knew about justice. A year later, when she returned to Hope Creek as the new CEO of Hale Resources, she would see him again standing by the same fence, the same horse beside him, the wind carrying the same dust that never quite settled, and when he looked at her, his eyes said what words couldn't. The fire never really ended. But that day, neither of them knew what was coming. They were just two survivors, sharing a silence between worlds, one built on profit, the other on soil and sweat. Somewhere in that silence, a seed had been planted, not of love yet, but of something rarer, recognition. Jenny drove away, the sun rising behind her, the old clock ticking in her mind. She didn't know it, but the man she left behind would one day make her face the truth, buried beneath every deal she'd ever signed. And when that day came, she would say the words that began it all. "You once saved my life, then do it again." A year later, the air above Hope Creek shimmered with heat again, but this time it wasn't fire, it was progress. Jenny Hale stepped out of a sleek black SUV, heels crunching the dust in front of the county courthouse. Her company's silver logo gleamed on the vehicle's door. Hale Resources, building the future of water. She adjusted her navy suit, the kind that belonged in glass towers, not on cracked Texas soil. A reporter snapped her photo as she turned toward the press line. "Miss Hale," someone called, "is it true your new project will bring water jobs back to Hope Creek?" Jenny smiled the kind of smile trained in boardrooms. "We're here to give this town a future," she said. The cameras clicked, but she caught a flicker of something else, skepticism, or maybe memory in the faces of the older townsfolk watching from across the street. It was the same courthouse where decades ago, men like Victor's father had been denied the right to own the land they worked. Inside, the meeting was a blur of legal talk, numbers, and signatures. Hale Resources had secured federal funding to build a regional pipeline. The only piece missing was access to one last tract of private land, a few hundred acres on the outskirts of town. Land that happened to belong to Victor Brooks. As she left the courthouse, the sun caught her eyes, and for a moment she saw the same orange haze as that night a year ago. She blinked it away and climbed back into the SUV. "Take me to the Brooks property," she told her assistant. The driver hesitated. "Ma'am, that's the old ranch by Dry Creek?" "Yes, I want to meet the owner." When they arrived, the place looked smaller than she remembered. The fence was leaning, the paint on the barn peeling, but everything was meticulously kept, the horses fed, the troughs full. She stepped out, and the dry wind tugged at her hair. The door creaked open and Victor emerged, wearing faded jeans and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. He looked older somehow, or maybe just more tired. "Miss Hale," he said, voice steady but wary. "Didn't think I'd see you again." "I didn't think I'd come back," she admitted, "but here I am." She extended a folder toward him. "I'm here on business. Hale Resources wants to lease the water rights on your land. It'll benefit the whole county, jobs, irrigation, everything." He didn't take the folder. "So that's why you came all this way," I wondered. "It's a fair offer, Victor. You'd be helping your neighbors." "My neighbors already have what they need," he said. "What they don't have is anyone to stop folks like you from taking the rest." The words landed heavier than she expected. She looked at him, dust on his boots, the faint scar near his temple, the lines carved deep by sun and loss. This was not a man easily moved by promises. "You think I'm like them?" she asked quietly. "Doesn't matter what I think. Matter is, people like you got pens sharp enough to bleed us dry without firing a shot." He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "You can dress it up in all the right words, but it's the same song my daddy heard before they took his land. That was a long time ago." "Not long enough," he said. She hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Victor, this project could bring hope back to Hope Creek. The wells are running low. If we don't act, there'll be nothing left." He studied her face for a long moment. "Hope's got nothing to do with wells. It's about trust. And we don't trust the people holding the pipes." He turned and started back toward the barn. "At least look at the offer," she called after him. "I did," he said without turning. "Before you got here." She stood in the heat, folder trembling in her hand. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rumbled, distant but coming closer. Sheriff Dalton's truck pulled up then, kicking up a cloud of dust. He was broad-shouldered, his badge glinting like a threat. "Afternoon, Miss Hale," he said, tipping his hat with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't expect to see someone like you out here alone." His gaze slid to Victor, hardening. "And you, Brooks, still trespassing on God's patience, I see." "Sheriff," Victor said evenly, "this is private property." "Everything's private until the county says it ain't," Dalton replied. He took a step closer to Jenny. "Ma'am, word of advice, folks around here don't take kindly to outsiders making promises, especially to his kind." The way he said his kind made her stomach turn. She forced a polite smile. "Thank you, Sheriff, but I can handle myself." "Suit yourself." He turned toward Victor and flicked the corner of his vest. "You hear me, boy? Pay your taxes on time this year. Wouldn't want an audit to ruin your day." Victor's jaw tightened. Jenny opened her mouth to protest. But Dalton had already climbed back into his truck. The tires spun, throwing dust and gravel at Victor's boots as he drove off. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, carrying the dry smell of rain that never came. Then Jenny said softly, "That was uncalled for." Victor glanced at her. "That's Hope Creek. You'll get used to it." "I don't think I want to." She took a step toward him. "Let me help. I can fix this. Maybe if I show the company how your land supports the aquifer." "You can't fix history with paperwork, Jenny," he interrupted. "And you sure as hell can't fix men like Dalton with a smile." "Then tell me what I can do." He looked away, jaw working. "Go back to your towers and your meetings. Leave this place to people who still believe it can be saved." "You're one of those people," she said. "Not anymore." He started to walk away, but she called after him, her voice catching in the dry air. "You saved my life once, Victor." He stopped, the wind tugging at his hat. "Then do it again. Save me from making another mistake." He didn't turn around, but she saw his shoulders stiffen. After a moment he said, "There's a cafe in town. Come by tomorrow. I'll show you what your company's done to this place." Then he walked into the barn, the door closing behind him with a hollow thud. Jenny stood there, heat pressing against her skin, the silence filled only by the ticking of that old clock she could still hear in her mind. For the first time since becoming CEO, she felt unsure which side of the line she stood on, the one that saved lives or the one that sold them. As she drove back toward town, the radio crackled with local news. Reports of the drought worsening, small farms closing, a county audit announced for non-compliant properties. She gripped the steering wheel harder. Dalton's words echoed. "Wouldn't want an audit to ruin your day." Somewhere behind her, on that quiet stretch of road, Victor watched her taillights fade. He spat into the dust and muttered, "You can't fight a system that feeds itself." But when he turned back toward the barn, his eyes fell on the small folded folder she'd dropped by the fence. He picked it up, brushed the dust off the Hale Resources logo, and sighed. That night, Jenny couldn't sleep. The hotel air conditioner hummed, but her thoughts were loud. She kept seeing Victor's face, the contempt in Dalton's grin, the weight of history pressing on both of them. Outside, thunder rolled again, closer this time. The drought was breaking, but not with rain, with reckoning. She didn't know it yet, but by returning to Hope Creek, she had set something in motion far older and deeper than business. And soon, she would learn that some contracts are written in ink, and others in blood and memory can never be erased. If this moment touched your heart, if you've ever had to stand between what's right and what's easy, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell us, do you believe that even one person can still make a difference, even when the whole world seems to stand against them? Your voice might be the very light that helps someone else keep fighting. The next morning, the town of Hope Creek woke under a heavy gray sky, the kind that teased rain but never delivered. Jenny sat alone in the corner booth of Daisy's Cafe, nursing a black coffee that had long gone cold. The place smelled of bacon grease and nostalgia, old vinyl booths, faded photos of high school football champions, the hum of a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Farmers in mud-stained boots sat at the counter, their low voices rolling like distant thunder. When Victor walked in, the conversation shifted, subtle but sharp, the way a wind changes before a storm. The men didn't speak to him, but they didn't have to. The silence did all the talking. He gave them a nod anyway, the kind that said he'd survived worse. When his eyes met hers, something softened in the air. He tipped his hat slightly, slid into the booth across from her, and signaled for 2 coffees. "Didn't think you'd actually show," he said. "I keep my word," Jenny replied, though she wasn't sure what that word meant anymore. "You wanted to show me something." Victor looked out the window before answering. "Yeah. But first, you need to understand what you're part of." He placed a folded newspaper on the table. The headline read, "Hale Resources acquires water rights for regional pipeline." Below it, a photo of Jenny shaking hands with a senator, smiling the corporate smile she now despised. "They printed that before the contract was even signed," he said quietly, "meaning the deal's done whether you agree or not." She stared at the photo, her stomach tightening. "That's not possible. I haven't approved anything." "Then someone did it for you," he said. "Happens all the time when money talks louder than truth." The waitress brought 2 fresh coffees and a plate of cornbread. Victor murmured a polite, "Thank you, ma'am," while Jenny stared at the steam rising from her cup. "I thought I could fix things," she whispered. "I thought if I came here myself." "You thought showing your face would make it honest," he interrupted, not unkindly. "But folks here have seen plenty of pretty faces signing ugly papers." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice sharper than she meant. "What have you done to make it better?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I stayed," he said simply. "When everyone else left, I stayed. Because this land doesn't heal if you keep running from it." The words hit her harder than she expected. For a long moment neither spoke. The clatter of dishes and muted laughter filled the air around them, but they were in a quiet pocket of their own. Finally, Victor stood. "Come on, time to see what progress looks like." He drove her out past the outskirts of town in his old pickup truck. The road wound through dry fields and rusted fences until they reached the riverbed, or what used to be a riverbed. The cracked mud stretched for miles, pocked with puddles that reflected the dying light. "That's the North Channel," he said. "It used to feed every well from here to the county line." He pointed to a concrete dam jutting from the canyon like a scar. "Now it feeds Hale's holding tanks, your holding tanks." Jenny stepped out of the truck, wind whipping her hair. The scale of it stunned her, huge pipes carved into the ground, diverting what little water remained. Workers in Hale uniforms moved along the site like ants. "I didn't authorize this," she murmured. "Doesn't matter, it's got your name on it." She turned to him, guilt rising like bile. "Victor, I swear, I didn't know." "That's what they all say," he cut in, not harshly, but with weary finality. "No one ever knows until the damage is done." They walked along the edge of the old riverbed. An old man sat near a dry well, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. Victor greeted him gently, calling him Mr. Carter. The man looked up, eyes pale and watery. "They said we'd get clean water, Vic. Said the pipeline would save the farms. Now my well's dust." His voice cracked. "My wife's buried up there by that sycamore, and I can't even pour water on her grave." Jenny's throat tightened. She knelt beside him, unsure what to say. The man studied her for a long time. "You from Hale?" "I used to be," she said softly. He spat into the dirt. "Then you tell your people we don't need saving. We need the truth." Victor helped the old man back onto his chair and turned to Jenny. "You wanted to see. Now you've seen." As they drove back, the first drops of rain began to fall slow, heavy, uncertain, like the sky couldn't decide if it still remembered how. Jenny watched the water hit the windshield, each drop leaving a streak like tears. "Why do you still talk to me?" she asked quietly. "After what my company did?" Victor kept his eyes on the road. "Because I saw you before the smoke cleared. You were scared, but you didn't run. Most folks with your money would have run." She almost smiled. "You think courage means staying?" "Sometimes. Sometimes it just means showing up again after you've been burned." When they reached his farm, the porch light glowed warm against the dusk. He killed the engine but didn't move. "There's a town meeting tomorrow," he said. "Dalton's pushing for eminent domain claims the county can seize this land for the project. If that happens, it's over. Not just for me, but for every farmer within 50 miles. "He can't do that," she said. "It's illegal. Illegal don't mean much around here when the sheriff writes the rules." He turned toward her. "You've got a choice, Jenny. You can be the face they hide behind, or you can help stop it." She looked out at the fields stretching into the dark, at the faint glow of the refinery lights beyond the hills. "If I help you, I'll lose everything. Then you'll know what it feels like to live here." The rain came harder now, drumming against the hood. She opened the door and stepped out, letting it soak her hair and clothes. It was cold, but it felt honest. "All right," she said, voice trembling but steady. "Show me where to start." Victor watched her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Tomorrow, at the town hall." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Don't come alone." Jenny stood there as his truck rumbled back toward the barn, the rain washing dust from her face. In the distance, lightning flashed brief and brilliant, illuminating the empty sky. She knew she was crossing a line, not of business, but of belief. For the first time, she wasn't acting as a CEO or a savior. She was simply a woman trying to make something right. Behind her, the town of Hope Creek shimmered through the rain, fragile and stubborn, clinging to the land like memory. Tomorrow, she would stand beside Victor, and together they would face the storm, both the one in the sky and the one that had been building for generations. The next morning, Hope Creek wore its history like an old scar, visible, deep, and unhealed. The clouds had cleared, leaving behind a sky too bright for comfort. Jenny stood at the edge of Victor's property, her heels sinking into the soft mud left by the night's rain. She wasn't dressed like a CEO today. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans, a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, and boots she'd bought from a local store the night before. She felt exposed, almost naked without the armor of authority. Victor came out of the barn, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands covered in soil. "Didn't think you'd show," he said, echoing his words from the cafe, but without the challenge this time. She smiled faintly. "I don't back out of things anymore." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the truck. "Come on, you wanted to see the truth. It's time you walked it." They drove down a narrow road that wound through the valley, past fields cracked by drought and fences leaning like tired old men. Children played near broken water pumps, their laughter thin but defiant. Victor slowed the truck, watching them quietly. "That used to be my school," he said, pointing at a one-room building with boarded windows. "Closed after the pipeline rerouted the wells. Kids have to bust 2 hours now just to learn what the world already forgot." Jenny looked out, feeling the weight of silence settle in her chest. "Doesn't the company know what's happening?" He glanced at her, a dry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think they don't know? They count every drop. They just don't care where it comes from." They drove further until the road turned to dirt, leading them to a dried-up creek bed where rusted pipes lay half-buried in sand. Victor stopped the truck, got out, and motioned for her to follow. "This," he said, kicking the cracked earth, "is where the first well used to run. It fed 4 farms and a town reservoir. My father built the pump by hand. They shut it down the same year he died." Jenny crouched beside the pipe, touching the cold metal. It was engraved with an old Hale Resources serial number. Her breath caught. This was ours. "Still is," he said. "Everything that's broken here has your company's name on it somewhere." She turned to him, guilt flickering across her face. "I didn't know, Victor. I swear to God, I didn't." He folded his arms. "You keep saying that, but knowing ain't the point. It's doing something once you do." His tone wasn't cruel, it was weary. The sound of someone who'd run out of patience with apologies. She stood, brushing the dust from her hands. "Then help me fix it. Tell me what to do." He looked at her for a long time, then sighed. "Come with me to the township later. You need to see how deep it goes." They climbed back into the truck, driving past the Baptist church with its leaning steeple, past shuttered grocery stores, past the sheriff's office where Dalton's truck sat parked like a warning. Jenny noticed people watching from porches, mostly white faces, guarded, suspicious. A woman whispered something to her husband as they passed. The man spat into the dirt. Victor noticed her tense. "Don't mind them," he said. "They've been told too many stories about people like me and people like you. Hard to tell which they hate more, black men standing tall or white women standing beside them." The words stung because they were true. By the time they reached the town limits, Jenny could feel eyes burning holes through the windows. They parked outside an old water distribution office, a crumbling brick building with peeling paint. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old paper. Victor led her to a filing cabinet in the corner. "Records," he said. "If they haven't been tampered with, they'll show when and where the wells were shut down." Jenny sifted through folders, her fingers trembling. Then she froze. "Wait," she whispered. "This can't be right." She held up a document with her company's letterhead dated 3 months before her arrival. They already approved the new pipeline route. It bypasses 3 Black-owned farms, including yours. Victor's face darkened. That's the plan. Starve us out so they can claim abandonment of property. He stepped closer, pointing at the signatures. See that name? Sheriff Dalton's brother-in-law. Head of county zoning. They've been working together for years. The anger that rose in Jenny wasn't the clean kind. It was cold, coiled, dangerous. We can take this to court, she said. If we show the county council. Council's in their pocket, Victor interrupted. They don't care about paper unless it comes with a check. Then we go public, she said, her voice firming. We find someone who will listen. Journalists, maybe. They'll bury the story before it leaves the county line. He turned to her, his eyes softening. This isn't about headlines, Jenny. It's about surviving long enough to matter. Her throat tightened. You talk like you've already given up. I talk like someone who's seen how this ends. He moved to the window, looking out over the empty street. My daddy tried to fight. The night before the hearing, someone torched his barn. By the time the fire trucks came, they were too late, just like always. Jenny felt her pulse in her ears. Victor, she said quietly, what if this time it's different? He turned, studying her as if weighing something invisible. You really believe that? I have to, she said. Otherwise, what am I even doing here? For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victor's expression softened, just slightly. You sound like my mother, he said. She used to say, justice is a stubborn river. You can dam it for a while, but it'll always find its way home. Jenny smiled faintly. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, he said. Cancer took her before she saw what they did to this place. He paused, then added, she would have liked you. Something shifted between them then. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 people on opposite sides of a story realizing they'd been reading the same line all along. He closed the file, slid it back into the drawer. We'll take this to the town meeting tonight, he said. But you need to be ready. Dalton won't go down easy. I'm not afraid of him, she said. You should be, Victor replied. Men like him don't fight fair. They don't need to. They left the office as the afternoon sun dipped low, painting the town in long shadows. On their way back, they passed the sheriff himself standing by his truck, talking to a group of men. Dalton's eyes followed them, his smile slow and poisonous. Evenin', Brooks, he called out. You and your lady friend planning a parade? Victor didn't answer, but Jenny felt his muscles tense beside her. Careful where you're headed, Dalton added, voice dripping with mock kindness. Roads get mighty dark this time of night. Jenny met his gaze through the truck window and saw at the hatred that wasn't just personal but generational, the kind that didn't die with time. She forced herself to smile. Don't worry, Sheriff, she said evenly. We brought our own light. As they drove off, Dalton's laughter followed them down the road. When the sound finally faded, Victor said quietly, You shouldn't have said that. Why not? She asked. Because men like him don't forget a woman who stands up to them, he said. Especially not one who used to stand above them. She didn't reply. The horizon glowed red in the dying light, and somewhere in that glow she saw the truth of what Victor had been trying to show her. Hope Creek wasn't dying because of drought or bad luck. It was dying because good people had been too afraid for too long. By the time they reached the farm, the night had settled thick and quiet. Victor turned off the engine, the only sound the ticking of the cooling metal. Tomorrow, he said, we face them. Jenny looked at him, her reflection faint in the window. No, she said softly. Tonight we plan how to win. And in the silence that followed, under a sky filled with the ghosts of forgotten storms, they began to chart the road to truth. Dawn crept slowly over Hope Creek, pale light spilling across the hills like a hesitant promise. Victor had been awake for hours, standing by the barn, staring at the horizon where the first sunlight hit the land his father once called sacred. The old clock inside the house ticked softly, steady and defiant against the silence. Its hands had stopped moving years ago, but somehow the ticking never ceased a sound that reminded him time didn't need permission to keep going. When Jenny stepped out of the guest room, she found him by the porch, mug in hand, eyes distant. You don't sleep much, do you? She asked. He didn't look at her. Sleep don't come easy when you've buried too much. She hesitated, sensing this wasn't a morning for business talk. The night before had left them both raw, stripped of corporate polish and careful words. The plan for the town meeting hung between them like a fragile truce. "What's with the clock?" she asked finally, nodding toward the open doorway where she could hear it ticking faintly. Victor turned, his gaze softening. "That old thing? My father's. He used to say it was the only inheritance worth keeping. Kept it running even when the hands froze up. Said, as long as it ticked, hope was still alive." Jenny stepped closer, listening. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It's stubborn," he corrected. "Just like him." She smiled faintly. "Sounds like someone else I know." He gave her a look that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't disapproval either. "Come on," he said. "We've got something to find before that meeting." He led her to the old shed behind the barn, where boxes of his father's belongings sat under tarps. Dust motes swirled in the sunlight as he lifted the covers, revealing stacks of ledgers, maps, and yellowed documents. "My old man kept everything," Victor said. "Even the lies they made him sign." Jenny knelt beside him, carefully opening one of the boxes. Inside were folded deeds and brittle papers stamped with the county seal. "These are land sale records," she whispered. "But these signatures, they look forged." Victor nodded grimly. "He told me once they forced him to sign while a man stood outside with a gun. Said it was for the good of the town." He pulled out a small velvet pouch, its drawstrings frayed. Inside lay a tarnished silver pocket watch engraved with initials, R.C. "Who's R.C.?" she asked. "Robert Cartwright," he said. "The man who owned this land before my father. When he died, his widow gave this to my dad as thanks for saving her from a flood. Years later, Dalton's family took the property back under new management. My father never forgave himself for trusting their word." Jenny turned the watch over in her hand, tracing the engraving. "It's evidence," she said. "Proof the land changed hands illegally." Victor shook his head. "Proof means nothing without power, but maybe it's time someone gave it a voice." They packed the documents and the watch into a worn leather satchel. As they drove into town, Jenny felt the weight of history pressing on her chest, the lives buried beneath paperwork, the kind of quiet theft that never made headlines. She glanced at Victor, his face set and unreadable, and wondered how many years he'd carried this alone. At the courthouse, the parking lot was half full. Farmers, ranchers, townsfolk, black, white, weary, and wary, all gathered for the council's emergency meeting. Sheriff Dalton's patrol truck sat out front like a predator waiting for a meal. Inside, the air was thick with tension and coffee. Dalton leaned against the wall near the front, his badge gleaming, his grin sharp. When he saw Victor walk in beside Jenny, his eyes narrowed. "Well, if it ain't Hope Creek's favorite hero and his city lady," he drawled. "Here to save the town again, Brooks?" Victor ignored him. Jenny followed close, clutching the satchel tight. They took seats near the front as the council chairman, a man with Dalton's same smirk, called the meeting to order. "We're here to finalize the eminent domain proceedings for the Hale pipeline," he announced. "Any objections before we sign?" Victor rose, his voice clear but measured. "I object." A murmur swept the room. Dalton straightened, his smile fading. "On what grounds?" the chairman asked. "Fraud," Victor said, pulling out the old deeds. "These documents show that the land you're claiming was stolen from my family and others under false signatures. My father didn't sell his property. He was forced." He handed the papers to the clerk, who looked uncertain but began reading aloud. Dalton shifted uneasily, then barked, "This is nonsense. That land's been county property for decades." "Then you won't mind if we verify those signatures," Jenny said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, the same tone she once used to silence boardrooms. "We'll match them with archived documents from Hale Resources. If you're telling the truth, Sheriff, you've got nothing to fear." Dalton's jaw clenched. "You don't belong here, lady." "Neither does corruption," she shot back. The room buzzed. An old woman in the second row, Ruth, one of Victor's neighbors, stood up. "He's telling the truth," she said. "I saw those men take his father's papers, burned half his crops for saying no." Another man spoke up, then another. The council tried to gavel them down, but the tide had turned. Dalton's face reddened. "You people don't know what you're talking about. You want to ruin this town? Fine. When that pipeline dries up, don't come crying to me." He slammed his hat onto the table and stormed out, leaving the room buzzing like a hive. Victor exhaled slowly. Jenny turned to him. "We're not done, are we?" He shook his head. Not even close. Dalton's cornered now, and cornered men are dangerous. As the meeting adjourned, rain began to fall outside, soft and steady, like forgiveness trying to find its way home. They walked to the truck in silence. When they reached the ranch, Victor placed the silver watch on the mantel beneath the ticking clock. "He'd have liked you," he said quietly. Jenny looked at him, rain glinting in her hair. "Your father?" "Yeah. He believed in people who fought for what's right, even when they weren't supposed to." She smiled, but her eyes were tired. "You think we can win this, Victor?" He met her gaze, steady and solemn. "I don't know about winning," he said, "but I do know this truth doesn't die easy, and tonight we gave it a heartbeat." As thunder rolled across the horizon, the old clock ticked louder than ever, its frozen hands still pointing to a moment long past, but its heartbeat alive, defiant, and echoing through every corner of Hope Creek. The town of Hope Creek seemed to hold its breath as Jenny and Victor made their way through the muddy streets, the weight of the previous night's victory settling heavily on their shoulders. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a dull gray, as if even nature was waiting for something to break. The storm had come and gone, but its aftermath, much like the battle they had just fought, would linger far longer. Jenny's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale as they made their way toward the small community center where the next town meeting would take place. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire town had gathered in one place, uncertain of what the future might hold. At least half the town had shown up, most of them gathering at the edges of the room, their faces a mix of curiosity, suspicion, and most troubling of all, fear. Fear of what was happening, and fear of what might happen if they didn't stand up. Jenny and Victor stood at the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe, watching the scene unfold. The town hall was filled with the murmurs of familiar voices, many of them weathered and worn from years of struggle. Yet there was an unmistakable sense of urgency in the air. People were talking, but not about the weather or the harvest this time. No. Today the conversation was different. "They've got your backs now," Victor murmured, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "They'll listen, but whether they act is another story." Jenny glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "They have to act. If we don't stop this now, we'll lose everything. This is the last chance we get to fix it." She could feel the pressure in her chest, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her. She had come to Hope Creek to make a difference. But now, more than ever, she understood how hard it would be to undo the damage done by people who had been lying and stealing for generations. "You really think we can win this?" she asked, the uncertainty in her voice betraying the fear that had started to creep into her heart. Victor looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but I know if we don't try, then we'll be just like the rest of them, people who gave up without even fighting." A few feet away, Sheriff Dalton stood by the door, talking with a small group of men. His eyes were scanning the room, his posture relaxed, but Jenny knew better than to think he wasn't calculating his next move. She could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. He wasn't going to let this slip by, not without a fight. The meeting began, and the room fell silent. The mayor, a stout man named Harold Baxter, called the session to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming in the small room, "we're here today to discuss the ongoing water rights dispute. As many of you know, the Hale Resources pipeline is nearly complete, and we're close to finalizing the sale of land to the company. But," his eyes flicked over to Victor and then back to the crowd, "but, as we all know, there are objections, and those objections need to be addressed before we can move forward." There was a murmur among the crowd, but no one spoke. Jenny could feel the tension rising. "We've heard from Victor Brooks and his associates about the alleged fraud regarding the land transfer," the mayor continued, pausing for effect. "Now, I'll open the floor for anyone who wishes to speak on this matter." Victor didn't hesitate. He stood up slowly, the room falling into a tense silence as he made his way to the front. "I'm here to tell you the truth," he began, his voice steady, though the anger in his eyes was barely contained. "This land wasn't sold. It was stolen from my family and from others. You think this is just about a pipeline, but it's not. It's about everything this town has lost, everything that was taken without anyone standing up to stop it." His words were simple but heavy, and as he spoke, Jenny saw the faces in the room shift. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable. It was the first real mention of the corruption that had been festering for years, and it had struck a nerve. "We've been told lies for years," Victor continued. "My father was forced to sign papers that he couldn't read, under threat. You think it's just water rights, but it's about what happens when you let people who only care about profit take everything, your land, your future, your dignity." His voice rose now, the emotion creeping in. Jenny's heart raced as she watched him. This was it, the moment of reckoning. This was the man who had lived with the injustice for so long. The man who had decided he wouldn't stand by while his community was torn apart. "You all know Sheriff Dalton," Victor said, his gaze shifting to the sheriff, who was standing in the corner, arms crossed, eyes narrowing. "He's the one who took the land from us. The same man who's been manipulating the system for years. The same man who has used his badge to take what doesn't belong to him. And now, he's using his influence to push through the pipeline, to finish what was started all those years ago." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were talking now, some nodding, others shaking their heads, but all of them listening. Jenny's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know if they could win this fight, but she knew that if they didn't stand up now, it would be the end of everything her company had worked for, everything Victor had fought for. Dalton stepped forward, his face tight with anger. "You've got no proof of any of this," he growled. "This is just a bunch of wild accusations from a man who doesn't want to lose his property." "You've got nothing to say that matters anymore, Dalton," Victor shot back. "Not after what we've found, not after the truth comes out." Jenny stood, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "We have the documents," she said firmly. "We have the proof of fraud, and we have witnesses who will back up everything Victor has said." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people in the crowd. "It's time for this town to decide what it stands for. Are we going to let one man destroy everything we've worked for, or are we going to fight back? It's time for the truth to come out, and it's time for justice to be done." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the people of Hope Creek began to stand. Slowly at first, then faster, until the entire room was on their feet, their eyes on the sheriff. They weren't afraid anymore. They were ready to fight. The mayor looked out at the crowd, his face uncertain. He turned to Dalton, who was now standing rigid, his face reddened with rage. "I think we've heard enough for now," the mayor said, his voice wavering. "This meeting will be adjourned until further notice." But the damage had been done. The truth was out. The people of Hope Creek had heard it, and they were ready to take their stand. As the room began to empty, Jenny caught Victor's eye. "We've got them," she said softly. "They're on our side now." He nodded, his face hard but proud. "Yeah, but we've still got a long way to go." And as they walked out into the damp evening air, Jenny felt something inside her shift, something that had been buried under layers of corporate policy and profits. She wasn't just a CEO anymore. She was a part of this community. And this fight was hers now, too. The sun was setting over Hope Creek, bleeding orange light through the cracks of the old barn where Victor and Jenny sat in silence. Dust hung in the air like memory, golden and weightless. The day had been long filled with whispers, side glances, and the uneasy tension of a town forced to look at its reflection for the first time in decades. Jenny sat on a wooden crate, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long gone cold. "They're scared," she said finally. "You saw their faces today. They want justice, but they're terrified of what it will cost them." Victor nodded slowly, staring at the fading horizon. "Hope Creek's been living scared for a long time. My father used to say fear is the sheriff's best deputy. It keeps folks quiet." He reached for the silver watch sitting on the table beside him, the same one his father had kept hidden for years, and ran his thumb over the engraving. He believed that time would fix everything, but time didn't fix this town. It just buried the truth deeper. Jenny watched him, her heart tightening. "Tell me about him," she said softly. Victor hesitated. The air between them grew still, heavy. "My father's name was Samuel Brooks," he began. "He was born right here, in Hope Creek, back when black men weren't allowed to own land outright. He worked the Cartwright property until the day the law finally changed. When Robert Cartwright died, his widow, God bless her, gave him part of the land. Said he'd earned it. For a while, it felt like things might actually be different." He paused, his voice dipping lower. "But when Dalton's father took over as sheriff, that hope didn't last long. They said the paperwork wasn't official. They said my father's signature wasn't valid. He fought it in court, but the judge was a friend of the sheriff. So they came one night, burned his barn, told him to sign the deed over, or they'd make sure no Brooks ever lived here again. His voice cracked then, barely audible. He signed, not for himself, but for me. He said a man can rebuild a house, but not a life. Jenny swallowed, the weight of his words settling in her chest. You were there? I was 10, he said. I remember the smell of the smoke, the way he stood there watching everything he'd built turn to ash. I remember thinking he looked small for the first time, like he'd been broken in two. But the next morning, he made me help him rebuild the fences. Didn't say a word, just worked until his hands bled. Victor's eyes drifted toward the fields, the soft hum of cicadas filling the silence. He told me, son, they can take the land, but don't you ever let them take your dignity. That's the one thing you've got to die with. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Jenny stood and walked to the door, looking out at the twilight settling over the ranch. Your father was a strong man. He was, Victor said. Too strong, maybe. He believed in fairness, but Hope Creek doesn't do fair. She turned back to him. Maybe it will now. He gave her a look that was half disbelief, half something softer. You really think that pipeline, those men, all that money, any of it cares about what's fair? Maybe not, she said, stepping closer. But people do, and people are starting to see. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slightly. You sound like him, he said. Always trying to see the good when the whole world's showing you the bad. Jenny smiled faintly. Guess I'm stubborn like that. Yeah, he said quietly. You are. The clock ticked behind them, its rhythm steady and unrelenting. Jenny could feel the weight of the moment pressing in their shared silence, their shared understanding of loss and resilience. She wanted to say something, but before she could, headlights swept across the barn walls. Victor's head snapped toward the door. Stay here, he whispered, grabbing the rifle that hung above the door. He stepped outside, boots crunching on gravel. Jenny followed him to the doorway, her pulse quickening. A black truck idled at the gate, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. Two men stepped out, silhouettes framed against the fading light. Evenin', Brooks, one of them called. It was Dalton's deputy, a man with a sneer carved permanently into his face. Sheriff wanted me to remind you about tomorrow's inspection. Taxes are due. Be a shame if your paperwork went missing. Victor's jaw tightened. You tell your boss I've got nothing to hide. The man smirked. Sure thing, but if you're smart, you'll start packing. That land's worth more to the county than it is to you. Victor stepped forward, but Jenny grabbed his arm. Let it go, she whispered. They want you to react. The deputy grinned wider, clearly satisfied with the tension he'd caused. Oh, and Miss Hale, he said, glancing past Victor toward her. Didn't know you'd gone local. Guess we all make poor choices now and then. Victor moved before Jenny could stop him. In one swift motion, he slammed the man against the truck, his voice low and dangerous. You ever talk to her again like that, and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt. The deputy's partner reached for his gun, but Jenny stepped forward, her voice sharp. Enough. Get off this property before I call the state office. You're out of your jurisdiction, and you know it. The men hesitated, then climbed back into the truck. As they drove off, dust billowed up behind them like ghosts rising from the ground. Victor stood there, chest heaving, fists still clenched. Jenny touched his arm gently. You can't fight them like that, she said. They'll use it against you. He turned to her, eyes burning. You think I don't know that? Every fight we ever lost in this town started with us trying to be decent. She met his gaze, steady. Maybe this time it ends with you being smart instead. For a moment, neither moved. Then the tension broke like a string snapping. Victor exhaled, the anger draining from his face. You're right, he said finally. I just can't lose this place again. You won't, she said softly. Not while I'm here. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time not as a CEO or an outsider, but as someone who understood. The silence stretched, thick with everything they couldn't say. Finally, he turned back toward the barn. We've got work to do before tomorrow, he said. Jenny nodded, but her heart was still racing. That night, as the wind howled across the plains, they worked side by side under the lantern's glow, sorting through papers, organizing evidence, preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming. And when their hands brushed over the same folder, neither pulled away. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear above the dark fields. Inside, the clock ticked on, steady as ever. Victor glanced at Jenny, her face soft in the lamplight. "My father used to say," he murmured, "that when you find someone willing to fight beside you, you don't let go." Jenny met his eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't." And in that quiet, unguarded moment, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of tomorrow, something new took root. A fragile, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken people could heal a town that had forgotten how to love. The wind howled through the fields that night, dragging dry dust across the yard like an omen. Jenny couldn't sleep. She stood by the window of the small guest room, looking out at the vast black stretch of Victor's land. The moon hung low and red, its reflection shimmering faintly on the metal roof of the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried, sharp and lonely. She wrapped her arms around herself, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the feeling that something had shifted, something dangerous. Downstairs, she could hear Victor moving. The sound of boots on old wood, the squeak of the back door, the faint scrape of a match being struck. He was outside again, pacing near the corral. Jenny stepped out onto the porch. "You should be sleeping," she said quietly. He turned, the light from the lantern catching his face. "Can't," he murmured. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face." "Your father's?" He nodded. "Feels like he's still here, watching. Like he's waiting to see if I do what he couldn't." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You already are." He gave her a long look, one that felt heavier than words, and then turned back toward the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but this town don't forgive easy, especially not men like me." Before she could answer, a faint popping sound cracked through the night. Then another louder. She frowned. "What was that?" Victor's head snapped toward the barn. "That's not thunder." He started running, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand. Jenny followed, her heart hammering. As they reached the barn, the air grew thick with the acrid smell of smoke. Flames licked at the hay bales, spreading fast along the wooden beams. "God damn it," Victor shouted, throwing open the door. "Get the horses out." Jenny covered her mouth, coughing as the smoke billowed around her. The fire was alive, roaring and hungry. Victor grabbed a rope and rushed inside, cutting the horses loose one by one, slapping their flanks until they bolted into the field. Jenny stumbled through the haze, her eyes burning, searching for water. The pump by the shed was dry. "There's a trough," she yelled, grabbing a rusted bucket. Together they worked in frantic rhythm, hauling water and tossing it over the flames, but it was no use. The fire was too strong, too fast. The roof cracked, showering sparks. Victor pushed her back. "Get out! I'm not leaving you!" "Jenny, go!" he roared. She stumbled backward as he turned, shielding his face from the heat. Suddenly a beam gave way, crashing down between them. For a moment she lost sight of him. Panic clawed at her throat. "Victor!" she screamed. No answer. The fire roared louder, its heat pressing against her skin. She tried to move toward him, but the smoke blinded her. Then, through the haze, she saw movement, a figure breaking through the flames, carrying something heavy. Victor emerged, coughing, his shirt half burned, cradling a small metal box in his arms. He dropped it to the ground beside her and fell to his knees, gasping for air. "What the hell were you thinking?" she shouted, tears mixing with soot on her face. He coughed again, struggling to speak. "It's my father's papers, the deed. Couldn't let them burn what's left of him too." She looked at the box, then at him, and realized his hands were blistered, the skin raw. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees, grabbing his wrists gently. "You're hurt." "I've had worse," he muttered. "You're shaking. So are you." Their eyes met through the haze, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "They did this, didn't they?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was all the confirmation she needed. "Dalton," she breathed. "He's not even pretending anymore." Victor looked out at the burning barn, his jaw set. "He's making his move. He wants me gone before the hearing." "Then he's scared," Jenny said, her voice trembling. "That means we're close." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Close to what? Losing everything?" She reached out, touching his shoulder. "No, close to the truth. He turned to her then, eyes fierce, desperate, the fire's reflection burning in his gaze. Truth don't matter when men like Dalton write the story. Then we'll rewrite it, she said firmly. Together. The flames behind them began to die, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of what used to be the barn. Victor stared at it, his face unreadable. That barn's been in my family for 3 generations, he said quietly. My father built it with his bare hands. Then we'll rebuild it, Jenny said. Together. He looked at her, and something inside him broke something hard, something old. You don't belong here, he said softly. You could leave, go back to your world, your company. Pretend none of this ever happened. I can't, she whispered, because you're my world now. He froze. For a moment, the words hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Then, slowly, he reached up, brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. You don't mean that, he said, though his voice was unsteady. I do, she replied. And if I walk away now, I'll never forgive myself. His hand lingered against her skin, rough and trembling. Jenny. She didn't let him finish. She leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, wild, the kind of kiss born from fire and fear and the knowledge that the world could fall apart at any second. When they finally broke apart, he whispered, You shouldn't have done that. Too late, she said, her eyes glinting with defiance. For the first time, he smiled a small, broken smile that somehow made her chest ache. You're trouble, he said. So are you, she replied. They sat there in the dirt until the first light of dawn crept across the fields. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind smoke and ash and silence. The horses grazed nervously in the distance. Victor flexed his burned hands, grimacing. You'll need those checked, Jenny said. We'll go into town. Can't, he muttered. Dalton'll be watching. If he sees me, he'll make sure I don't come back. Then I'll go, she said. I'll get supplies. He nodded reluctantly, his eyes still on the ruins. Be careful. Always. She turned to leave, but then stopped, looking back at him. Victor, she said softly, you can't fight this alone anymore. You don't have to. He didn't answer, but as she drove away down the dirt road, he whispered to the wind, I know. When Jenny reached the edge of town, she caught sight of Dalton's truck parked outside the sheriff's office. He was leaning against it, talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. As she passed, he looked up and smiled, slow, cruel, and knowing. Her stomach tightened. She drove on, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. Back at the ranch, Victor stood among the ashes, the old clock ticking faintly inside the house, its rhythm steady despite everything. He looked down at the metal box at his feet, then opened it. Inside lay a photograph of his father, smiling in front of the barn that was now gone. For the first time in years, Victor let himself cry not for the barn, not even for the past, but for the fragile hope that had taken root in the middle of all this ruin. And somewhere deep in the earth beneath his boots, where fire and water met, something new was stirring, the slow, inevitable current of justice beginning to rise. The morning after the fire, the world around Victor seemed quieter than it should have been. Smoke still clung to the horizon, drifting lazily over the fields like a ghost refusing to leave. The barn was nothing but a skeleton, now charred beams jutting from the earth like bones. The smell of burnt wood and wet ash filled the air, sharp and stubborn. Victor stood there for a long time, boots buried in the soot, his hands still bandaged from the night before. Every creak of the wind against the ruins reminded him of his father's voice, the lessons buried in every splinter of this land. Don't bow to them, son, Samuel Brooks used to say. They can own your land, but they'll never own your soul. Victor closed his eyes and whispered into the emptiness, I'm trying, Pop. I swear I'm trying. He turned when he heard the sound of a truck approaching. The gravel crunched, and Jenny's white SUV came into view, dust swirling behind it. She parked near the old fence and climbed out, her face pale but determined. She carried a small medical bag and a stack of papers clutched under one arm. You shouldn't be out here alone, she said, walking toward him. I told you I'd come back. And I told you Dalton would be watching, Victor said. He's got eyes everywhere. She shrugged, brushing hair out of her face. Then let him watch. I'm not afraid of him. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small, tired smile. You're getting used to life out here. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe I just stopped being afraid of getting my hands dirty. She looked toward the ruins, her expression faltering. I brought some supplies. And there's something else. She handed him the papers. I found this in the county archives. He unfolded the top sheet. It was a deed, an old one, yellowed and stamped with the county seal. That's the original ownership record for this land, Jenny explained. Your father's name is still on it. Dalton's family never filed the transfer legally. They forged the second set of documents, but they never voided this one. Victor's heart hammered in his chest. You mean, it means you still own this land, Victor, legally. And if we can prove Dalton tampered with the records, we can take this straight to the state court. He let out a shaky breath, holding the paper as if it were something holy. You did this? She smiled faintly. You taught me something. You said time doesn't fix what's broken unless you make it, so I made it. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of church bells from the town. Victor folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his jacket. Then we're going to finish what he started, he said quietly. Your father? She asked. He nodded. He died believing the truth would die with him. Guess we proved him wrong. Jenny smiled, but her eyes were distant. We're not done yet. Dalton knows you survived the fire, and that'll make him desperate. Let him come, Victor said, his voice low. This time, I'm ready. That afternoon, they drove to town together. Hope Creek felt different, tense, alive, like a wire stretched too tight. People watched them from porches and store windows, their stares filled with something between hope and fear. Jenny noticed an old man tipping his hat as they passed. Word spreading, she said. They know. Victor nodded. They just need someone to believe it for them. When they reached the courthouse, Dalton's patrol truck was already there. He was leaning against it, chewing on a toothpick, his hat tilted low. The smirk on his face made Jenny's stomach turn. Well, if it isn't my favorite couple, he drawled as they approached. Heard you had some trouble last night. Shame about that barn. Real tragedy. You light it yourself, Dalton? Victor asked evenly. You think I'd waste a good night's sleep on your shack? Please, maybe it was lightning. God's judgment, maybe. Jenny stepped forward before Victor could answer. Funny, she said coldly. I checked the weather report. No storms last night. Dalton's grin faltered for just a second, then returned. You city folks sure do love your reports, but out here, things just happen. Fires, accidents, bad luck. You never know. You'll call it bad luck when the truth burns you, Victor said. Dalton's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. Careful, boy. You talk like that again. I might start remembering old laws about trespassers and thieves. Victor took a slow step forward. Then remember this, your time's up. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. You think some papers and fancy talk will change anything? This is my town. Jenny met his gaze, steady and calm. Not anymore. They walked past him, pushing through the courthouse doors. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the smell of old wood and ink. The clerk behind the counter looked startled as Victor laid the documents on the desk. We're filing a motion to reopen land ownership case #height 712B, Jenny said clearly. Brooks versus County of Hope Creek. The clerk hesitated. That case was closed 25 years ago. Not anymore, Jenny said, sliding the old deed across the counter. New evidence. The clerk studied the papers, her eyes widening. This signature, this is the original. And this stamp, it's genuine, Jenny said. You can verify it. The clerk nodded slowly. All right, I'll send this to the state office for review. As they turned to leave, Victor looked at her. What happens now? Now we wait, she said. And we make sure Dalton knows we're not backing down. Outside, Dalton was gone. Only the dust from his truck lingered in the air. As they walked back to the car, Victor glanced around, his instincts prickling. He's not done, he muttered. He's planning something. Jenny opened the door. Then we planned faster. The drive back was quiet, the kind of silence that hums with things unsaid. When they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low again, setting the sky ablaze in streaks of orange and red. Victor stopped the truck and looked out at the ruins of the barn. My father used to say fire's got a way of purifying, he said. Maybe he was right. Jenny touched his arm gently. Sometimes you have to burn something down to see what's worth saving. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, the fight, the anger, all of it fell away. You ever think maybe you were meant to end up here? he asked quietly. She smiled. Maybe I was always supposed to find my way back to something real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver watch. Then you're part of it now, he said, placing it in her hand. This was my father's. He'd want you to have it. Jenny stared at it, speechless. Victor, I can't. You already did, he said simply. You gave me back my father's name. She closed her fingers around the watch, the weight of it anchoring her. Then I'll keep it safe, until all this is over. It's not just a watch, he said. It's a promise. That night, as they stood on the porch, the cicadas hummed their mournful song, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Jenny leaned against the railing, watching the stars appear one by one. You think we'll make it through this? She asked. Victor didn't answer right away. He looked out at the dark fields where his father once walked, the ashes still fresh underfoot. Yeah, he said finally, but it won't be easy. Nothing worth saving ever is. And somewhere in the quiet night, the old clock inside ticked once more steady, relentless, unbroken, marking not the end of something, but the beginning of the reckoning to come. The next morning broke heavy and still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. A mist had settled over the fields, thick enough to blur the line between land and sky. Victor stood on the porch with a cup of black coffee, staring into the fog, listening. He could feel it in the air, the storm before the storm. Inside, Jenny was on the phone with the state office, her voice calm but firm. Yes, we filed the documents yesterday, she said. No, we don't want it delayed. Sheriff Dalton has already interfered once. If the file goes missing again, there won't be a Hope Creek left to fight for. She paused, listening, then nodded. Thank you. Please call me as soon as you have confirmation. She hung up and walked outside, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders. They said it'll take a few days for the paperwork to process. But they're looking into the forgery charges immediately. A few days, Victor muttered. That's all Dalton needs to make this go bad. He took a slow sip of his coffee, eyes on the road that disappeared into the fog. He's not going to take this lying down. He'll come for us before that file ever reaches the state office. Then we'll be ready, Jenny said, but her voice betrayed a flicker of fear. He turned to her. You sure about this? This fight, it's not just about my land anymore. It's about a system that's been rotten since before either of us were born. You stand next to me. You're going to get dragged down into it. Then I'll go down fighting, she said, because I'd rather drown in truth than breathe in their lies. The way she said it steady, unflinching, made something stir in him, something that felt too much like hope. He wanted to tell her that he'd never met anyone like her, that somehow she'd taken the weight of his father's ghosts and carried it without flinching. But before he could speak, a sound broke the morning stillness, the low growl of an engine approaching fast. Victor's body tensed. Get inside, he said sharply. Jenny froze. Who is it? Go. He set down his cup, his jaw tightening as a black pickup truck came into view through the fog. Two men sat in the cab, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. The truck skidded to a stop in front of the porch, and the door swung open. Sheriff Dalton stepped out, wearing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Morning, Brooks, he called, his voice slick as oil. Heard you've been making a lot of noise lately. Victor didn't move. You're trespassing, Dalton laughed. I figured since this land's under dispute, that means it's technically public property now. His deputies climbed out, one of them carrying a shotgun. Jenny stepped onto the porch beside Victor, her face pale but her chin high. What do you want, Dalton? She demanded. Oh, nothing much, Dalton said, pacing slowly toward them. Just thought I'd check in on my two favorite troublemakers. Heard you've been digging through old records, stirring up ghosts that should have stayed buried. Victor's fists clenched. You burned my barn, Dalton smirked. Now, why would I do a thing like that? Fire's dangerous, Brooks. You gotta be careful with old wood. Tends to catch easy. Jenny's voice was cold. You'll regret this. The state office has everything. The original deed, your forged signatures, every lie you've told this town. Dalton chuckled, shaking his head. You really think those papers mean anything? You're fighting against the same system that made men like me. You can't beat it. He turned toward Victor, his eyes glinting. Your daddy thought he could too. You know how that ended. The words hit like a slap. Victor stepped forward, rage boiling under his skin. You don't talk about him. Oh, but I do, Dalton sneered. Because I was there, boy. My old man made sure your daddy knew his place. You think you're any different? You think this town will ever let a man like you own anything that matters?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Victor's hands shook not from fear, but from holding himself back. He wanted to hit Dalton, to end it right there, but Jenny's voice stopped him. "Victor," she said softly, her hand brushing his arm, "don't." Dalton noticed, and his grin widened. "Well, isn't that sweet? The city girl and the farmhand. You think you're making history, huh? I'll tell you what, you're making a mistake." He nodded to his deputies. "Search the house. Make sure they're not hiding any stolen documents." "You can't do that," Jenny snapped. "You don't have a warrant." "I don't need one," Dalton said, stepping closer. "See, when the sheriff says there's probable cause, that's the law." Victor moved in front of her, blocking Dalton's path. "You step 1 foot in that house, and you'll have to go through me." Dalton stopped, eyes gleaming with something dark and cruel. "That can be arranged." For a long moment, the two men stood inches apart, the air crackling with hate. Then Dalton leaned close, his voice low. "You're going to lose everything, Brooks, and when you do, that pretty lady of yours won't be around to help you." Victor didn't think. He swung. His fist connected with Dalton's jaw, the sound sharp in the cold morning air. Dalton stumbled back, spitting blood, his grin now twisted with fury. "Big mistake," he hissed. "Arrest him." The deputies raised their guns. Jenny stepped forward, shouting, "Don't you dare!" But before she could move, Dalton barked, "Stand down, not here." He wiped the blood from his lip, his smile returning. "You're not worth the paperwork, Brooks. Not yet. But your time's coming." He turned, motioning for his men to follow. "Let's go, boys. Let the hero simmer a little." As the truck drove off, the rumble of its engine faded into the mist. Victor stood still, breathing hard, his knuckles bleeding. Jenny touched his arm gently. "Victor," she whispered, "you shouldn't have done that." "I know," he said, his voice raw. "But I'd do it again," she sighed, stepping closer. "They'll come back. We need to prepare." "We will," he said, "but not here." He turned toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the old church rose through the fog. "We need to take this fight to where it started." That afternoon they drove to the edge of town, to the old Hope Creek Church, abandoned for years but still standing tall against time. Inside, the air smelled of dust and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through cracked, stained glass windows, painting the floor in colors that had long since faded. "My father used to come here," Victor said quietly. "He said this was the only place in town where a man could speak truth without being silenced." Jenny ran her fingers over the worn pews. "Then it's where we'll speak ours." They spent the rest of the day drafting letters, gathering copies of the evidence, preparing statements for the hearing. When the sun began to set, Victor lit a single candle at the altar. "For him," he said. Jenny watched him, the flame flickering in his eyes. "For all of them," she whispered. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of smoke, not from the fire that had destroyed his barn, but from something new, something rising. The fight was no longer just about land or legacy. It was about survival. It was about love. And as the candlelight danced against the walls, Victor reached for Jenny's hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "I'm glad you're here." She smiled faintly, her fingers curling around his. "I'm not going anywhere." The church bells rang in the distance, slow and mournful, marking the end of the day and the beginning of the reckoning that would decide everything. The morning of the hearing dawned with a thin layer of frost over the fields, turning every blade of grass into glass under the pale Sunday. The road to Hope Creek's courthouse was lined with trucks and tractors, townspeople standing in clusters, whispering in tight circles. Word had spread faster than fire. The day had come when Victor Brooks was taking Sheriff Dalton to court. For the first time in decades, Hope Creek wasn't afraid. Jenny sat beside Victor in the old pickup, her fingers tight around a folder of documents, her face pale but steady. "You ready?" she asked quietly. "I've been ready my whole life," Victor said, eyes fixed on the courthouse steps. It's time they saw what we really are. The square was buzzing with tension. Men who had once looked away from injustice now stood shoulder to shoulder. Women clutched their children's hands. Reporters from neighboring counties had come too, cameras flashing as Victor and Jenny stepped out. Dalton stood at the top of the courthouse steps, his hat low, his uniform crisp, the same smug grin on his face. "Well, look who decided to make a spectacle," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Hope Creek's fallen hero and his lady from the city." Victor met his gaze squarely. "We're not here for a show, Dalton. We're here for justice." "Justice?" Dalton chuckled. "In this town, justice wears a badge, and you don't." Jenny stepped forward, her voice calm but cutting. "That badge doesn't protect you from the truth," the crowd murmured. Dalton's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat. Inside, the courtroom smelled of wood polish and dust, like every secret it had ever buried was still trapped in the walls. The judge, an older man with gray hair and a slow, thoughtful gaze, called for silence. "We are here to review the petition filed by Mr. Victor Brooks regarding ownership of the property known as the Brooks Homestead," he began. "Evidence has been presented suggesting potential forgery and misconduct by local law enforcement." Dalton shifted in his seat, but said nothing. Jenny laid out the documents one by one, the original deed, with Samuel Brooks's signature, the county's copy with the forged version, the transaction ledgers showing Dalton's father's involvement in illegal transfers. The room grew quieter with each page. When she finished, she looked up. "These papers prove not only that the land was taken illegally, but that this town has been built on silence and fear. It's time that ended." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Sheriff Dalton, do you have a response?" Dalton rose slowly, his voice dripping with false calm. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. These so-called records were found by a woman who doesn't even live here, a CEO who thinks she can buy redemption by meddling in local affairs. These documents probably fakes themselves. And that man," he pointed at Victor, "he's been nothing but trouble since he got here. You think his family didn't sell that land? Then where's the proof his father said no?" Victor stood. "Right here," he said, pulling a folded letter from his jacket. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. "This was in my father's safe. He wrote it the night they forced him to sign. He knew one day someone would come looking." He handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The old man read in silence, his expression hardening with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Dalton. "This letter states that Sheriff Thomas Dalton coerced Samuel Brooks into surrendering his property under threat of violence. That's a crime, Sheriff, even 25 years ago." Dalton's face went red. "That's a lie," he shouted. "That man would have said anything to make himself look innocent." The judge banged his gavel. "Enough." The room erupted whispers, gasps, murmurs of, "I knew it," and "about time." Dalton turned toward the crowd, his control slipping. "You people think he's some kind of hero? He's a fraud, just like his father. You think this town survived on honesty? It survived because men like me kept it running." "No," Victor said, his voice low but firm. "It survived in spite of men like you." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here, boy. You never did." Victor took a step closer. "Maybe, but this land does, and it's mine." Dalton's hand twitched toward his belt. Jenny saw it first. "Victor!" she cried. The sheriff's revolver gleamed under the courtroom lights. Gasps filled the room. Dalton's hand shook slightly, his voice hoarse. "You think you can take everything from me? I built this town." "You built it on fear," Victor said, his voice steady. "But fear's done listening." The judge's voice rang out. "Sheriff Dalton, put the weapon down." But Dalton didn't move. For a tense, endless moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, like a breaking dam, everything happened at once. A deputy lunged forward, knocking Dalton's arm aside. The gun went off, and the sound exploded through the room. Jenny flinched as the echo died. Dalton stumbled, staring at the smoking gun in disbelief. The deputy wrestled it from his hand as the judge shouted for order. Dalton fell to his knees, the weight of years crashing down at once. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "It was supposed to stay buried." Victor stared at him, breathing hard. "But truth doesn't stay buried, Sheriff. It grows roots." Two deputies hauled Dalton to his feet, cuffing him as the crowd broke into a low murmur, not cheers, not yet, but something that felt like relief. The judge cleared his throat. "Given the evidence presented, I am ordering an immediate suspension of Sheriff Dalton and a full investigation into his office's conduct. Furthermore, the court recognizes Victor Brooks as the rightful owner of the Brooks homestead." Victor closed his eyes, the words sinking in like rain after drought. Jenny reached for his hand, and for the first time in years, he felt his father's promise finally kept. Outside, The sky had cleared, the fog lifting to reveal a bright, endless blue. People gathered around Victor, clapping his shoulder, shaking his hand. "About damn time," one old farmer said, grinning. "Your daddy'd be proud." Victor smiled faintly. "Hope so." Jenny stood beside him, the silver watch in her palm, the ticking steady against her skin. "It's over," she said softly. "No," Victor replied. "It's just beginning." They walked together down the courthouse steps, through the crowd that parted to let them pass. Hope Creek had changed, maybe just a little, maybe forever. Behind them, the courthouse bell rang out 12 times, each toll echoing across the valley like a heartbeat. And as they reached the truck, Jenny looked at him and said, "Your father's land is yours again. What will you do with it?" Victor glanced at the horizon, where the sun burned bright over his fields. "Rebuild," he said simply. "Not just the barn, the town too." She smiled, slipping her hand into his. "Then I guess you'll need some help." He looked down at her, eyes soft. "Guess I will." And as they drove away, the clock back at the Brooks farmhouse ticked on, no longer a relic of the past, but a witness to the future that was finally theirs to claim. The weeks after the hearing passed like the slow thaw of winter. Hope Creek, a town once strangled by silence, began to breathe again. The headlines spread through the county: Sheriff Dalton removed, land rights restored to Brooks family. For the first time in decades, people talked about justice not as an impossible dream, but as something that could be touched, something that might actually belong to them. The first rains of spring came early, washing the ash from the fields where Victor's barn once stood. It had been nearly a month since the fire, but he still found himself looking toward that empty patch of earth every morning, the smell of smoke still ghosting through his memory. Now, though, it was no longer a place of loss. It was a beginning. Jenny came up the dirt road, her boots dusted and her hands full of coffee mugs. "You've been staring at that spot for an hour," she said, setting one mug beside him on the porch rail. Victor smiled faintly, taking it. "I was thinking how my father used to start every day right there. He'd talk to the land like it was alive, like it listened. I used to think he was crazy." Jenny sipped her coffee, watching the horizon. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it was listening all along. It just needed someone to talk back. He looked at her then, his eyes tired but clear. "You think we can bring it all back? The land, the trust, everything that was taken?" "Not everything," she said softly, "but enough." Behind them, workers hammered and shouted, raising the first beams of the new barn. The sound was raw, alive, a rhythm that matched the beating of the old clock inside the house. The town had rallied. Men who once turned their backs now lent their hands. Women brought food and tools. Kids ran barefoot through the mud, laughing as if the world had just reset itself. Even Ruth Carter, the widow who'd watched her well go dry, stood nearby, helping paint new fence posts. "You rebuild in more than a barn, Victor," she told him that morning. "You rebuild in faith." He didn't know how to answer that, so he just nodded, heart too full for words. Later that afternoon, Jenny drove with him to the edge of the property, where the dry riverbed had once run. The dam upstream, the one that Hale Resources had built under Dalton's approval, was being dismantled. Victor parked the truck and stepped out, the wind whipping gently through the tall grass. He could hear the faint rush of water, real water spilling down the rocks again for the first time in years. "It's coming back," Jenny whispered. "You did it." "No," Victor said, watching the current swell. "We did it, and so did everyone who stopped being afraid." The sound of the water grew louder, washing over the land like forgiveness. He closed his eyes and could almost hear his father's voice in the rhythm of the flow, steady, patient, eternal. When he opened them again, Jenny was standing close, her hand brushing against his. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. "Going back to your world, your company?" She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "That world feels small now, plastic. Everything there was about profits and appearances. Here, it's about people, real people, and maybe about something else too." He turned to her, the sunlight catching in her hair. "What's that?" "You," she said simply. He blinked, caught off guard by the softness of it. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the water filled the silence, its music unbroken. "You don't have to say anything," she added, her voice trembling just slightly. "I just needed you to know." Victor set his coffee cup down on the truck bed, and took a slow step toward her. "Jenny, when you showed up that first day, I thought you were just another city woman with good intentions and soft hands. But you," he paused, his voice thickening, "you got grit, you got fight. You stood where even I wanted to run. And I ain't never seen that before." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "That sounds dangerously close to a confession." He grinned, a rare warmth lighting his face. "Guess it might be." He took her hand, rough against soft, and squeezed gently. "You saved more than my land. You saved me. And you reminded me who I was," she whispered. They stood there for a long while, hand in hand, the sound of the river rising around them like a hymn. By evening, the whole town gathered near the church for a meeting not out of fear this time, but out of purpose. The old wooden building glowed with lamplight, and the air hummed with laughter and low voices. Ruth had brought apple pie. The Cartwrights donated lumber for rebuilding the town well. Even the mayor, once silent under Dalton's thumb, stood and spoke. "We forgot who we were," he said, "but this man reminded us. Victor Brooks stood up when no one else did, and we're better for it." The crowd cheered. Victor shook his head, embarrassed but moved. "Ain't about me," he said. "It's about all of us. My father used to say, 'Justice ain't a gift, it's a seed. You plant it, you tend it, and one day it grows, but only if you take care of it.'" The room fell quiet, the words sinking deep. Jenny watched him, her heart swelling with something fierce and tender all at once. When the crowd began to disperse, she walked over, touching his arm lightly. "You really are your father's son," she said. "Guess I am," he said softly. "And maybe now I can finally be my own man too." They stepped outside together, the night air cool and clean. Stars spilled across the sky like scattered embers. In the distance, the new barn stood half-built, but strong. The river shimmered beyond it, winding its way back to the valley like it remembered where it belonged. "You hear that?" Victor asked. Jenny listened. "The water?" "Yeah," he said. "It's singing again." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting and start living." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "I reckon you're right." As the night deepened, a soft wind carried the scent of rain and cedar across the fields. The town that had once been divided by hate and fear now stood united under the same stars, its heart beating again. The river that had died was flowing, the land that had been stolen was home once more, and the man who had once carried the weight of his father's failure now carried only the promise of tomorrow. Inside the farmhouse, the old clock ticked on the mantel, steady and unbroken, its frozen hands forever pointing to the moment when everything changed. And though Victor never wound it again, he could swear sometimes, just sometimes, that he heard it ticking louder whenever Jenny laughed. Perhaps it was his father's way of saying the land was alive again, or maybe it was simply the sound of love taking root in a place that had finally remembered how to grow. The story of Victor and Jenny reminds us that justice is not something given, it's something fought for, tended like the land itself. It teaches that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried under fear and corruption, will always find its way back to the surface when someone dares to stand up for it. Through courage, compassion, and forgiveness, even the deepest wounds of a community can begin to heal. And in the end, love quiet, steadfast love becomes the bridge between pain and redemption, proving that what's broken can always be rebuilt if the heart still believes,